scholar, Marina Warner, is a veteran magus and an adept mythographer of the vast global traditions of magic, metaphor, and myth. Also an accomplished novelist, she augments her learning with her narrative skills. As a fan of her prolific enterprise for the last quarter century, I regret that I have never met her, so delightful is her verve. I thought they had to meet. And tonight they have met on this occasion to discuss Marina's most recent book, Stranger Magic, Charmed States, and the Arabian Nights. Marina Warner, we're very honored to say, has taught already for NYU Abu Dhabi, and I should have said welcome to the home of NYU Abu Dhabi in New York. I am Hilary Bellin, the Deputy Vice Chancellor. I was so distracted by all of these amazing things that I neglected to introduce myself. Marina taught for us last January, as we anticipate she will again in a year's time, and it was a beautiful convergence of an educational project and of a research project that Marina was pursuing on the Arabian Nights. We'll be hearing from Harold Bloom, who clearly needs no introduction. We'll be hearing from him on some of the themes I imagine he touched on in this review. But what I wanted to call attention to was another theme that actually is not brought out in the review, that is, I think, very pertinent to the educational mission that we are pursuing. In her introduction, Marina writes about the many different cultural strains that come together in the Arabian Nights. And then she writes, in the current state of conflict and flux, with domestic tensions, foreign wars, and also the possibilities for change in the Arab world, pursuing the well-rehearsed racial and negative values of the past does not contribute to opening a dialogue, uncovering a neglected story of reciprocity and exchange can make for greater understanding. And one place where the conversation between East and West took a different shape was fiction, especially fabulous stories packed with wonders, elastic in handling time and place, and plotted according to the different laws of fate and magic. Reading the Nights as a case study in the contact zones of history offers a path towards changing preconceptions about Arabs, Islam, and the history and civilization of the Middle and Near East. Contact or translation zones may be flashpoints for conflict and indeed fields of protracted oppression, but they are also areas of mingling and interfusion of a process of creolization. So this is a book that really speaks very much to, I must say, NYU Abu Dhabi and our commitment to the humanities and to storytelling. So it is a great honor to have you both with us tonight. The evening will begin with some remarks from Harold Bloom. Then we will have a very short break. I'm sorry that it's warm down here. I appreciate your indulgence. Maybe that will be an occasion for you to get a cold drink. And then we will resume after that short break with remarks from Marina Warner. Thank you both.
Well, it wasn't quite what we'll do next one. And of course, it's not necessary. You took my order, you guys up.
Excuse me.
Let's see. I'm in my 57th consecutive year teaching at Yale, where I hope I will hold my Wednesday and Thursday classes this week. I gather that this perfect storm should be over by then. If you have any power people, I suppose the classes will be there. In any case, since I haven't been to and counting, I cannot really, I teach at Yale 2 classes, one on Shakespeare, these days one on American poetry. They extend for an hour and 50 minutes, which is the tradition of Yale discussion groups. But because of my various infirmities at this age, including the fact that I just must not sit for more than about 30 or 35 minutes at a time, my students, some of them are here actually, I've gotten used to the fact I'm moving this way too. It will not be first I will talk and Marina talk, right? I've written a little memorandum here right up about it for all of it, just to get us started. But I'll confine myself to 10 minutes, which should take me to a little past 5:30. Then Marina and I will have a conversation, which I trust she will do almost all the talking. And I have to teach her. And then on just about 5 or 6 or so, I will decree a 5 or 7 minute break, and then we'll start again and go to perhaps look like 6:30 or so, and then I believe she intends to show some slides or pictures, but I will, accompanied by my wife and a couple of friends, I will get back to our apartment. Since this is an oddly not sponsored affair, there's no alcohol, and I will very much want some cognac. Let us commence. The book is, of course, remarkable. The title, as you know, is Stranger Magic. The subtitle is important, Charmed States and the Arabian Nights. I remind you just a few very quick things about this strange word. It has no named author or authors whatsoever. It has no place of composition or clear dates of composition. The ultimate sources of the story are as varied as Arabia in all its manifestations, Persia, now Iran, of course, and all of India. Its impact on Europe is from the 18th century on. Voltaire, Dr. Samuel Johnson, are all part of that story, but it goes on endlessly after that throughout the high Romantic age. It can be said to climax more or less in what was my time of with Borges, who was fascinated by it, and who urged us, and this always goes to my heart, I knew him slightly, and we agreed on the necessity of misreading, as we both put it. So he wanted his work misread, and indeed lent itself now. This is an instance of magical thinking, as importantly done, of gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, which can be translated as knowledge, might be something closer to acquaintanceship as a tongue twister. For me, because of the Bronxian upbringing. I take it that magical thinking is in fact what we call literary knowledge. And the stranger magic of Marina's subtitle reminds me of the god of Gnosis, historically speaking, who's always called the stranger god because he is not of this cosmos at all. I will speak purely personally for just a moment or two concerning the old groom himself. I was greatly influenced in my youth by three great scholars of the esoteric. All of whom became friends, the first two quite close friends. All of them blind figures, Gershon Scholem, Hans Jonas, Henry Corbin, C.R.U.I.N., who was the great scholar of Yale Sufi literature. Indeed, I contributed a long introduction to the poem Princeton paperback of Ralph Mannheim's translation, rather good translation of his creative imagination, the work of Ibn Arabi, who was certainly one of the great figures in the Sufi Shia tradition. I think I mentioned, though I don't have it with me, I think I mentioned in my review of Marina, but I was reminded as I read her book of what Corbin had taught me to call the imaginal realm, which is sort of suspended between the empirical world and the kind of vision that we're used to in the works of William Blake and William Butler Yeats and such figures. Literary knowledge is, of course, a kind of gnosis. It is related by Marina, as it was by my late friend Sir Isaiah Berlin, to the counter-enlightenments. Corbin spoke of the situation of esotericism. I suppose in some sense, though Marina will talk about what she wishes to talk about, I would like to keep coming back to that is to say secular Hermeticism out of 2nd century Alexandria, Christian Gnosticism, which has the same source, Jewish Kabbalah, which is very difficult to characterize, Neoplatonism, which certainly had one center, both Jewish and secular and also Christian, in 2nd century Alexandria. But I won't go on with this now. I will mention one figure. There is a kind of dialectic, a kind of antithetical relationship set up in Marina's book between the Arabian version of Solomon the Wise, who's the master of the unruly jinn, that is to say the daimons or the genii, and he himself, I would call the emblem of what I've learned to think of as literary knowledge, and of Aladdin, the trickster, and the escape artist. And a great deal of the 15 wonderful retellings of selected tales that Marina gives one seems to me suspended very neatly between those polarities. So, Marina.
Well, thank you so much.
No, go ahead.
Well, I have to say that to be reviewed by Harold Bloom with an invitation in the first paragraph to meet was rather like being summoned by Solomon himself.
My wife is there to testify, but this is hardly the case.
As we know from the Bible and from suggestions in the Quran, Solomon sometimes has moments of lapsing.
He's lapsing into water when he wants contact. Go on.
So, well, I think that it meant a great deal to me, and I wanted actually to quote. I was thinking about your work, which of course is vast, and a lot of it is based in marvelous.
In a way, we have to talk about you.
No, but this is the way I talk about myself. We're talking about other things. And there's a phrase from your own Millennium, which is the only book I've actually reviewed, which really stuck in my mind, which was that for that group of Kabbalists in Prague in the 16th, 17th century, you write that every letter was an angel, and the space between the letters were angels. And this idea of the sort of the absolutely intense power of the inscribed word was something that I found really powerful in the story of the Nights. Because the Nights is about a woman in bed with her husband trying to save her life. So she's using the word, which is then, when her story is successful, when he says, or someone in the story says, that is a beautiful story, there's a phrase they use, which is, it should be inscribed with a needle in the corner of the eye, and then it would be a lesson to instruct the wise. And so here you have the translation of the word, spoken word, which is the prayer or the blessing or the incantation. Oh, you didn't have this.
I've been teaching and lecturing for 57 years, and even though my voice is old and cracked, it still carries. So I don't want to.
Anyway, so in this image of the inscribed eye, you get the idea of the voice being translated into the magic of the writing, and the writing acts in the Arabian Nights, as perhaps it does in the Kabbalistic writings you were writing about in Emmons Lane. It acts as a protection, as a shield. As Shahrazad tells her stories, she frequently tells stories in which people are trying to win safety for themselves. She is trying to win safety for herself and for all women.
Well, otherwise her head gets sliced off her dog.
Exactly, and also he will then do it to another woman and so on and so forth, so she represents her whole sex. And by implication, really, the human race. And here we have the figure of a tyrant. But also within the
Apple juice, my dear, it's apple juice. We are not violating Abu Dhabi. I'm blessedly thankful. I dedicate it to you and to Karen.
Of course, it's one of the contradictions with the Nights and such rules. There's a lot of drinking in the Nights. I think one of the reasons that the book doesn't always win tremendous approval.
Oh, bliss. This will show up in my hearing.
Anyway, I was saying that from the very beginning of the Shahrazad stories are often these ransom tales, and the tale itself is working to create security, to create harmony, to restore justice. And it's actually rather amazing that we're going through these terrific conflicts in Syria at the moment. And you know, you really can see in the idea of the tyrannical figure, you know, destroying things around himself. You'll see this tradition that was being spoken to, you know, what Said called speaking truth to power. You can see it in the Nights. The rage of the Sultan at the beginning is irrational. It has no rational. We're not. He just completely loses his mind with jealous rage, decides to kill all women, and we see that gradually tempered by this book, which is considered just a heap of fairy tales. But in fact, the underlying message of the book is one of enlightenment. So that was one point I wanted to make. But I was actually, you know, this idea of the counter-enlightenment being a counter, I don't entirely get on with that. I mean, this idea of counter, I was trying to say that actually within irrationality, fantasy, fairy tales, superstition, the enemies of the Enlightenment, there actually are points of illumination. And you've written greatly about that. I want to quote two more things that are talismanic for me that you've written. You said once that we welcome literary metaphor because it enables fictions to persuade us of beautiful, untrue things. That's quoting, you say you're quoting Oscar Wilde. And then you carried on in the same paragraph, you said, I tend, that's you, to define metaphor as a figure of desire rather than a figure of knowledge. And that seems to me to be key about this false conflict between enlightenment and counter-enlightenment.
Well, it is the desire to be different, the desire to be elsewhere, that leads to metaphor, which is indeed what needs metaphor in is transference, is to carry something across as opposed to stream.
Yes. And I think one of the ways that this mistake has taken place is that we've ceased to, something happened in the, I don't know when it happened, but it's received wisdom that in order to show rationality, to show the luminous light of reason, what you write should have some kind of basis in verifiable empirical fact. So the actual corollary of this kind of thinking is realism, naturalism, because only realism and naturalism are open to proof. So if you're then in the world of imagined worlds, you're in the world of fantasy, you're in the world of perceived and impalpable phenomena, which is what happens in fairy tales like the Nights. This is not available to verifiable criteria, and therefore is irrational. It then falls under the same obloquy as was meted out.
I wouldn't say irrational here, I might say more than rational, or as Mr. Stevens writes, to reason with a later reason.
Yes. He said what? To reason with a...
To reason with a later reason.
Yes, yes. But that reminds me of, there's an artist called Rainey Horn, who takes rather beautiful, rather mysterious, almost metaphysical photographs. And she made a very tragic book in London of photographs of the surface of the water of the Thames, where below bridges where suicides had been recorded, and they were just utterly blank. So there was an elegiac book, and the names were remembered and the date of the terrible accident. So and her phrase for this book was, "Beneath every water there is another water." And that, I very much like this idea. And it
sounds rather like Satan in Paradise Lost. In every depth, a lower depth opens,
yes,
to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. Terrible.
But I think that if you take it, rather than what it's saying, if you take it as an image of how literature works, that beneath the surface of the tale, which of course is hugely pleasurable, full of entertainment and invention and energy and delight, but beneath that surface there is perhaps this watermark, this other depth, which may not necessarily be melancholic or terrible. It might be emancipatory, it might be blissful. But through the, and this is, seemed to me, is how, it was one of the reasons that it explained a contradiction for me, because the Arabian Nights came out in French in 1704. Yes. And then it took off in the 18th century, so it continued to be extremely popular through the period of Enlightenment. Well, people have usually explained that this was a kind of letting off steam or escapism, or, but no, it seems to me that actually if you, the Arabian Nights might have appealed to Enlightenment of Europe, precisely because beneath the surface tension there was another print. And the other print contains many, many messages, but certainly one of them is this idea of justice, of watching for the complexity of human nature, rather than just jumping off the deep end of what we first see. Understanding that things might be different from their surface appearance. Many of the stories are about mistaking appearances, and then realizing there are characters who are turned into animals, but somebody notices that this animal is intelligent, and so one realizes that beneath the animal form there is a person.
I'm suddenly reminded of one of Coleridge's strange citations from the Arabian Nights. He celebrated blue stocking. This is Laetitia Barbauld said to him concerning his famous rhyme against Marina, surely the moral of your poem, Mr. Coleridge, is that he who endures to the end shall be saved. He said, no, not at all. It has no moral. He said, it is exactly like that story in the Arabian Nights in which a man is famished, arrives at an oasis where there is a well, finds a fig lying alongside it, devours as much of the fig as he can and flings the rest into the well. A vast daimon or genii, one of the jinn, emerges from the well, obtruding and menacing, and says, I really regret this, you poor fellow, but I'm now obliged to kill you because you have just put out the only eye of my only son. Illustrative, really, of the madness of all this.
No, I realized, I know that you have argued quite powerfully against the literary humanist way of reading, and I probably do fall into that. I'm very glad that you...
No, it's a question might be, in the course of a long life of controversy, you take one stance or another, not like the abominable wrongdoing. Because the enemy to what might be called imaginative reason is very different at one time or another. When I was first coming up way back there in the 1940s and 1950s, the enemy was the abominable T.S. Eliot and all of his neo-Christian worshippers who thought he was Christ's vicar on earth. I ran into a great deal of that in the early stormy years in a department I happily abandoned back in 1976, the once great Yale English department. I'm delighted to say that now, for the last 36 years, I'm professor only myself. And of course, since I agree with myself on very little, it makes for stormy meetings, especially in the middle of the night. But well, it all depends who the adversary is. When there was a time when one took various stances, because one wished to preserve the romantic tradition, or one wished to preserve book reading for its own sake, free of any ideology, except what my late friend Paul Lamont insisted, to my chagrin, upon calling the aesthetic ideology. And I said to him, Paul, aestheticism is not an ideology. He said, Harold, you have to go on believing that. And the trouble with you, Harold, I can imitate your strange love, is that you do not believe in the truth. No, I did not believe in what Paul thought was the truth. I don't think I believe in any truth whatsoever, except that one wants the strong traditions poetry and imaginative prose and narrative fiction and drama to go on in spite of all societal pressures, all politics, since all politics are equally horrible and money-driven. There was a time when, yes, Marina, I would have taken us, from a book called The Western Canon, way back there, like 1984 or 5 on, I've taken a very different view indeed. I'm condemned as being a cultural conservative. I'm, of course, nothing at the time. I'm as zany and eccentric as ever. But one wants to save what can be saved. And after all, the great enemy of anyone who feels immensely for Shakespeare and Dante and Cervantes and Homer and Tolstoy, that is to say, for a measure of literature that's most powerful. The great enemy now is a visual age in which the young, from the beginning, find themselves staring at screens, which is not a way of learning how to read deeply, or how to use both the outer and the inner ear. That's why I begin everyone, in fact I go right through my discussion groups ever since I came back from a near-death illness and experience 4 years ago. I ask the students to read aloud, whether it's prose or verse, the text that we're discussing, and then we all look at them exegetically or appreciatively together.
Well, I agree completely with that, but I think I'm more hopeful than you. Maybe it's the advantage of being just a little bit younger. And it's,
well, you're considerably younger.
And, well,
right, he's 17 or 18 years old. Almost old enough to be your fault.
Anyway, I actually, I'm hopeful for 2 reasons. One, I actually think that alongside too much reading on screen is a return to quite a lot of oral communication. And certainly in England, where I come from, the performance poetry, or the performing of poetry, and the performing of the kind of enfleshment of works of literature.
It all depends, my dear, what is being performed. I once was ruined into a ghastly occasion. It was, as you might say, spontaneous prosody, to quote my late friend Alan, was going on non-stop. I got out as quickly as possible.
No, I know.
It was the death of art yet once more.
Yes, but I think that in all the arts, the cyber reality of our world, the kind of immateriality of so much experience that is digitally transmitted, has actually produced a countervailing desire, quite strongly expressed, to have embodied and enfleshed actions. And definitely in storytelling, I mean, when I first began writing fairy tales, and thinking about fairy tales, they were exclusively for children, and the only reading aloud was done between parents and children. And now that has changed. There is now a lot of kind of belief in the radio as a form of storytelling medium again in Britain. There's a lot of performance on
The
the
reading
stage.
aloud that matters, forgive me, Marina, for me, is carried out by men and women of all ages, but particularly the young, and preferably outdoors and in a solitary, safe place by themselves. They can go and chant Milton and Shakespeare and Spencer and Wordsworth and so on out loud to themselves and hear their own voices. But I distrust them. I distrust the communal in this regard. There can be an enlightened classroom, and I try to provide that in my increasingly failing way, because obviously at 82 plus I'm not what I was when I started teaching at 24 or 25. But I'm a great believer in going apart to read out loud in the solitary.
What I have to is I agree that really hasn't. That's because these activities I'm talking about tend to have audiences too, so they tend to be gatherings. I mean, it's interesting that museums and art galleries have actually brought in a lot of the spoken word. and a lot of poetry, and there are quite a number of artists in England are also introducing literary themes and writers. They often, Sebald, for example, W.G. Sebald has produced an extraordinary amount of responses from different artists. With
very powerful,
different, yeah.
very powerful, right?
Yes.
That tragic end, right?
Yes.
You know, we had corresponded before that, and I regretted his sudden departure. You know, for many years, I don't do it anymore for obvious reasons of infirmity, but for many years at Yale in New York City, once or twice or 3 times in Boston, I introduced the poets of my generation or the generation just before or the rising generation after me. Had an immense number of readings, including, you know, the poets I most cared for in my time after a certain generation. Not the generation of Wallace Stevens and T.S. Eliot, but the generation of Elizabeth Bishop, and after her, my friend John Ashburn, who I'm glad to say is alive and well, but he recently fell and hurt his knee for fall. And always afraid of falling. It's a constant fear. It reminds me, I must have introduced Elizabeth Bishop to my poetry, although I found rather complex and enigmatic person, a dozen times, mostly at Yale, but also elsewhere. And I always at the end of it asked her to read aloud as a sort of bonus or encore a poem that I loved, and she evidently didn't care for a very early poem called The Unbeliever. And I hear it all the time in my head because my great fear is that it ends, the goal, G-U-L-L, inquired into his, the unbeliever's dream. The goal inquired into his dream, which was, I must not fall. The spangled sea below wants me to fall. It is hard as diamonds. It wants to destroy us all. She rebelled finally, and she said to the audience, Professor Bloom always asks for this poem. He seems to like it. I hate it. I will not do it. I rebel. So that, but I was just thinking, it's only very rarely when you're hearing the poem for the first time. I remember with John Ashbery, this happened with Wet Casements, and also with a few other poems with my friend William Merwin, W.S. Merwin. It happened with that wonderful poem called Departure's Girlfriend. And somehow they sang themselves into my head and heart immediately. But I wonder how much, if people don't have a text in front of them, they can get out of an oral performance.
Well, I mean, the other place that has happened is the sound archives have now become very, so we're getting a lot of new recordings.
Yes, I know.
Which actually, I mean, that's another way of trying to keep the word, to give it this vibration when it's spoken, when it has breath in it.
I wish they had started earlier.
But actually, I want to go back to, I mean, I think on this sort of idea of the metaphor of breath in the word. I want to go back to one of the...
Did you say breath?
The breath in the word, yes. When you say...
Human.
Yes.
Okay.
Because that's, I mean, when you say the word aloud, that's what's happening to it. It's being inflated by air, it's being given this. And I think that in some ways, I want to put to you the third...
That's the name, you know, forgive me for interrupting you there. That's the name for Gnostic indifference. It's interesting that you go on.
Well, of course, it's inspiration and also expiration.
Yes.
And it's very, I mean, it takes us back to
They
something...
oppose it to the mere psyche, which is an outward form compared to that. It's the spark, they call it. Go on.
Yeah, because I wanted to take us back to the Arabian Nights, and there was something else that you wrote that I think is absolutely marvelous, which is you say that the function of Ariel and Puck in Shakespeare, you want them to be looked at in rhetorical terms, as beings that create a bridge between our human world and fairy worlds. And then you bring in a word that was used in 16th century English, which I didn't know before, called a far-fetched.
Oh yes, that's George Putnam, Puttenham, who wrote this marvelous rhetoric in Shakespeare's time, George Putnam.
Yes.
And that's the far-fetcher, as he called it.
Yeah.
And he used it in a sort of funny sort of way. And he meant by it a trope that my friend Angus Fletcher and I, and my last permanently somewhat crippled friend, the marvelous poet and critic John Hollander, have been using for years, the metalepsis, or transsumption, as it were, the trope of a trope, in which you reverse lateness and earliness. But go on,
Well,
this is very interesting to me.
well, here.
But maybe rather technical for our...
No, because it's very much what I think happens. I want to take it back to the Nights. So this far-fetcher, as when, this is George Putnam, as when we had rather fetch a word, a great way off, than to use one nearer hand to express the matter as well and plainly. So here you have the idea of the far-fetched metaphor, the trope, that actually reaches out far to come back. And it seems to me that that is one of the ways that the Nights have been read. That they are the far-fetched.
Or as Borges would say, misread.
Misread.
Strongly misread, creating them.
And within them, of course, they have these. I mean, here it's you're applying it to Ariel and Puck. And Ariel and Puck are the closest beings in our, Western canon to the jinn of the Nights.
Well, they are jinn in every sense.
I mean, it's amazing.
They are genii or daimons.
Absolutely.
Except that Ariel, though without affect, is benign. And Puck is, he may be charming, but he's rather darksome. He's not really to be trusted.
No. But they are
Robin Goodfellow, he has a double aspect.
Yes.
He's not such a good fellow after all.
No, he's that merry wanderer of the night.
Yes.
And but the jinn, of course, are also ambivalent. They can be.
Well, there's a touch of the hermeticalness, of Mercurius, of Hermes. One remembers suddenly that the mercurial person is a human being and not a jinn. And Shakespeare is the marvelous figure of Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, whom by tradition is what?
And he knows the Queen Mab speech.
A great Queen Mab speech, yes. Which of course, I think each time I read it now, or teach it in class, I think of you and of this book of yours. There is a tradition which I absolutely believe that Shakespeare told Ben Jonson, I think it's an old Brit, that he reluctantly had to kill Mercutio off because otherwise Mercutio would have killed the play. And anyone who has seen, there's an old movie, not a particularly good one, in which, however, there's a marvelous performance by the very late John Barrymore as Mercutio, which is astonishing acting.
And in this state, she night by night gallops through lovers' brains.
Yes.
And that's exactly what, I mean, that's...
It's the strangest speech of its kind in all of Shakespeare. It seems to be in the wrong play. It seems to come out of the Midsummer Night's Dream, but it doesn't.
But it does capture, I mean, it captures something else. I mean, there are two things that I want to say about the jinn that apply to also to Ariel and Puck and to Queen Mab speech. And that is that they are narrative dynamics. You can do, if you have a jinn in a story, you can do things with that story which you can't do without. That's exactly what happens with Ariel. You have a storm, Prospero can conjure up a storm because Ariel is there to do it. The lovers can be enchanted in the wood because Puck is there to do it. So there's a way in which these beings are the actual energy, the energy of story embodied. And they're simply the agents of surprise, resolution, recognition, but they're characters. So there's that. Then the other thing is prophetic in the Queen Mab speech, and which is one of the ways I felt that the Arabian Nights had every reason for becoming an influential book in the Enlightenment, is this understanding of the life of dreams. I mean, Shakespeare of course has it, but it's again very, very marked in the Nights. in the experience of dreams, and we needed to wait till psychoanalysis confirmed this, the experience of dreams does have a bearing, however mad the dream seemed, does have a bearing on our view.
Let's begin by talking about dreams indeed. But we have come, my dears, to the break. So as the jazzmen used to say, let's take 5 and then reassemble.
So you talked about imaginal reality, about the literary knowledge and the imaginal realm. And Wallace Stevens said something which for quite a long wrote something in The Pure Good of Theory, which for a long time meant a lot to me, but I've slightly changed my... He said, he wrote, this is the nicer knowledge of belief, that what it believes in is not true. And you know, you were talking earlier about belief, and I think when you were talking just a little bit earlier, and your difference with Eliot is something that troubles people and in a way has never been fully accepted by most readers, and that is that there would be no ontological reality behind the words that you're reading. So the nicer knowledge of belief, that what it believes in is not true, that is a very difficult position for most people to accept, that what they're actually believing is not true.
But it's more dialectical than that. Stephen's actual statement is... No, I don't want the microphone. Hard to hear? I'm sorry. No, I do want the microphone. Forgive me. I forget that my voice is old and cracked.
That's Virgil, Dante.
Stephen says the final belief is to believe in a fiction with a nicer knowledge, and he's being ironic and nicer, of belief that what one believes in is not true. And I would think that it's part of his endless meditation upon what he calls the supreme fiction, in which, as he would put it, the high romantic imagination, particularly in its American variation as the American sublime, takes the place of a belief in God. If poetry is, as he keeps insisting, one of the enlargements of life, and the ultimate enlargement that you're looking for is to go on by yourself, knowing that the poem is a frail vessel, but still a fiction that declares its status as fiction, is not an untruth. It is a refusal to deceive either oneself or others. It's his version, surely, of what Dr. Sigmund Freud meant by reality testing, or the reality principle, which is learning to live with the full weight and impact of one's own mortality, with no sense that there's any way of mitigating the consciousness of such mortality.
Yes. I mean, I feel that although, as I say, this idea of, I mean, I absolutely, completely revere Wallace Stevens, so I hesitate to utter a word of, but I felt after reading the Nights and thinking a little more about the kind of realities that they created, that actually you are not in a state of understanding that you're not believing. You are in a state of belief, but it's a different kind of belief from the belief that religions demand. You're not believing in something ulterior. There is no referent outside.
Well, you believe in story for its own sake. You believe in what could be called a fiction of duration.
Of duration?
Yes, that as long as it goes on, you will live.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And that, of course, is the drama of the book.
Yes. And I wake up frequently, and there are books piled on a table near me. These days, it's a volume of Walt Whitman and Moby Dick.
Moby Dick will keep you going a long time.
Well, I read them in the middle of the night, and I brood on how different they seem at 2 a.m. or at 4 a.m. Stevens writes somewhere in one of his poems, like a book at dawn, beautiful and true, like a book at evening, beautiful and untrue. He plays with the very idea of fiction, which ultimately I think in him is taken from Oscar Wilde again, whom you cited earlier.
Yes.
Oscar believed, as he put it, in beautiful, untrue things. He has that wonderful essay, The Decay of Lying, in which he suddenly cries out, "The whole of Japan is a pure invention. There is no such country. There are no such people." And he's thinking of Whistler's rage for things Japanese. Though Oscar and Whistler was a long story, I love the moment in which Whistler was an American and fiercely witty, and after a while Oscar began to fear him. And on one occasion, Whistler got off a tremendous aphorism, I forget what it was at the moment. And Oscar said wistfully, "I wish I had said that." And Whistler crushed him by saying, "You will, Oscar, you will." Well, I'm sorry, this is a distraction. Go back.
No. I mean, actually, I have great difficulty this story of Japan not existing. I think one of the great difficulties when one's read a great deal is actually remembering the reality and not the book. I mean, I find that I go to countries and quite soon after I come back, my original image of the country, which I got from books, it superimposes itself, intervenes, and the real experience I had drifts away. So that Japan, indeed, is still to me the Japan of imagination, the Japan of, say, Shonagon, and the Japan of watercolors, and not actually what I experienced when I went there. Because
Oscar would have loved you.
So the fiction, yes, well.
But Stevens also says the fiction that results from feeling. And that surely is the clue in all of this. One reads not just to pursue metaphor, to fulfill the desire to be different, the desire to be elsewhere, but the desire to feel more intensely, and yet, insofar as it's possible for us as mere human beings, I wouldn't say more dispassionately, but in a more withdrawn kind of a way, which is the miracle of Shakespeare, who seems more exuberant and passionate than any other writer. It also seems strangely withdrawn from his creation.
There's a big exhibition of Shakespeare at the moment in London. Shakespeare is called Shakespeare Staging the World. And it takes references and images from Shakespeare and finds material correlates of them. So there's a Spanish sword, which is what Othello uses to kill himself. And so it's a little bit sort of literal and mechanical. But it actually does show that Shakespeare almost always reached out beyond his experience. I mean, there is nothing terribly... I mean, when he was staging the world, he was staging an imaginary world that was actually very distant from him. The only mention of anything contemporary, apparently, any contemporary conflict, is there's one reference to the Irish Wars.
Yes, just one.
Just one.
And it's dubious.
Is it?
No.
And I think...
We're not sure that it's not an editorial interpolation.
Really? So
I think he committed himself very early to a view that he would free himself from his own time. This goes against, of course, all contemporary historicism, but I loathe historicism, whether it be old historicism, new historicism, this or that. It's always a lie against the reader. I agree with Emerson. There is no history, only biography. And Shakespeare's biography, as John Keats said, is in his characters, it's in his people.
Do you think that, I mean, do you think this is something that happens because he's Shakespeare, or do you think that it really is difficult to write as intensely with the emotional depth that you're talking about, if you remain close to your own, if it's recognizable as the place where you are? I mean, this idea of the farfet, is the farfet necessary? And of course, I'm gesturing towards the Knights again, because it seems to me that this displacement, this which has been much criticized, the exoticism, the Orientalism, but the displacement is part of the same maneuver that takes Shakespeare endlessly to, you know, to Venice, to Illyria, to the Tempest's Island. You know, the further you are from the face of the daily recognizable experience of your audience, the more you can actually, and it's a sort of, seems to be an inbuilt paradox, an inbuilt contradiction.
We have endless documents about Shakespeare, particularly about his lawsuits. He seems to have been anxious to sue at the least possible provocation. That must be why Jack Cade in Henry VI, as his rebellion is momentarily successful, announces the first thing we do is we hang all the lawyers. An admirable sentiment. But we just don't know. We have endless outer facts. We know nothing about the inner man whatsoever. We can't explain the miracle. That the strangest thing about Shakespeare for me is one period of 14 months. Can one believe that a human being in 14 consecutive months, sitting there in taverns, writing away on foolscap with a quill, should have composed a work unimaginable for a human being, The Tragedy of King Lear, and then, discontented with it, compose an entirely new version of it, then without a break, write Macbeth as an afterthought, and then again without a break, suddenly toss off Antony and Cleopatra in 14 consecutive months. And there's no question that he did it. It defies my understanding. I don't know what I'm dealing with. I gave a lecture to end a Yale lecture series on Shakespeare. Was it last spring, Ginny? In Battelle Chapel, where I'd never been before, which I found a dreadful large room to be in. Forgive me, Travis, wherever you are. But I remember at the beginning of it quoting Heinrich Heine, who said magnificently, "There is a God, and his name is Aristophanes." And I said, well, the corollary to that, my full belief, and this is the right place to say it, Battelle Chapel, once Congregationalist, now non-sectarian, I chanted, "There is no God but God, and his name is William Shakespeare." Because so far as I can see, it makes perfect sense to say that Shakespeare is God. I don't think that Yahweh is God, or that Allah is God, or that Jesus Christ is God. Forgive me, Abu Dhabi. William Shakespeare is God. He has created more men and women, 1,000 minor characters, totally individuated, who speak in voices separate from one another, 100 major protagonists who have inwardness, whom you can spend a lifetime studying. And he's created these four figures, endless to meditation. Hamlet, Falstaff, Iago, Cleopatra. They stop the mind. You go on thinking about them and trying to foreground them. And it's endless. You can't know where you are in regard to it.
Have you found that over the course of your life, some characters have come to mean more to you than others? I mean,
Oh yes.
So
Oh, yes.
who mattered most to you when you first read Shakespeare?
Falstaff.
Oh, really?
I've even acted Falstaff with the American Repertory Theater up at Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the Yale British Arts Center, at the Shakespeare Society here. And Barnardine, that wonderful rascal
gosh.
who says, I refuse to die today for any man's persuasion, in Measure for Measure,
Yes.
whom I've acted also. But now that I've gotten really old, my views have altered. I'm fascinated, as everybody gets to be, by the very last phase. You know, we say last phase, but he was very young. He dies just about his 52nd birthday, which is terrible when you think of what he could have done. And yet he stopped writing. For 3 full years of his life, at the end, he doesn't write a word. He just stops. That means that first the Winter's Tale, and then the Tempest, and then his part, if it isn't all of it really, of Henry VIII, which is more of a pageant than a play, and it's not something I find particularly interesting, and then something that fascinates me. He went back to to Chaucer's, shows I'm getting tired, children, to Chaucer's The Knight's Tale, and with John Fletcher, who at his suggestion took his place as the resident dramatist of the Globe Theatre people. He wrote the first and fifth acts of an astonishing work, The Two Noble Kinsmen. Fletcher wrote acts 2, 3, and 4, and they're unreadable, at least by me. But acts 1 and act 5 are unlike any previous Shakespeare. They're savage, they're furious, they equate sexuality and war as though there is no difference between the two, particularly male sexuality. They carry a kind of rancidity, that's the best word I can find for it, far beyond even Timon of Athens or Troilus and Cressida. Incredibly bitter. I don't see how it could ever be acted on. Go on, dear, go on. I'm talking too much.
No, I was just going to say that someone remarked that the only happily married couple in Shakespeare were the Macbeths.
That's me. I always say that to my students. I do point, well, Petruchio and Kate in The Taming of the Shrew are really, they fall in love at first sight, and we always get that play wrong. It's a delightful romp for both of them. They're just playing a part. They wind up very happily together. Indeed, they're the most curious kind of successful marriage, which always bothers me immensely when I encounter it among friends. When two people make of their highly successful marriage a kind of conspiracy against the rest of the world. But it is true that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have a furious passion for one another. And most of the marriages in Shakespeare will not bear, for instance, if there were an Act 6 of Much Ado Without Nothing, can you imagine waking up the morning after the wedding day at the honeymoon breakfast of Beatrice and Benedict? It would be a horror show. I don't think Shakespeare took a very cheerful view of human marriage. The sonnets to the fair young man, I don't care whether it was Pembroke or Southampton or a blend of the two.
Beautiful Southampton.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. The young man is atrocious, clearly, a monster, and he's willing to. I mean, there's clearly a homoerotic basis there, but it's nothing like that terrible furnace of heterosexual passion in which you descend in the Dark Lady sonnets, including the frightening one which finally declares in 3 words, desire is death, of the terrifying opening, like a drum roll leading to an execution of Sonnet 129. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action, until action lust is murderous, perjurous, bloody, full of blame, enjoyed no sooner than despise it straight. You know, horrible, a real horror of human sexuality. My late friend Anthony Burgess and I, he introduced me to Fundador, a nice, cheap, I don't suppose there's anything left of this rather superior Remy Martin. I'm sorry, dear. Well, we do have to go on for a while, my dear.
Marina,
We owe it to our friends here in
Sorry?
front of us.
can we ask you something?
What, Charlie? Yes, dear.
Can I ask her something?
My dear, I'll be delighted. I can shut up.
You've put two words together that ordinarily are not associated to each other, enchanting reason. And I really would love to hear something from you about how you were connecting them. That could be a lifetime study project.
No, it's just that.
Or I'm happy to just keep drifting with you guys.
No, I want to hear this.
But I really, it's because to me the realm of enchantments, the realm of imagination, the realm of fantasy, the realm of storytelling and such, ordinarily is not
The
governed by
elixir, my
reason.
dear, the elixir.
And yes,
Well, it is what I tried to write about in the book, and we did begin with discussing it. I mean, one of the main areas that I sort of emphasize and think is one of the reasons for the appeal of the Arabian Nights is that the imagination is the only place where speculation can take place. And I try to show that this is not necessarily contradictory to reason, but we have this idea that the experiments must be verifiable to be bona fide, to have any value. Whereas actually what is happening in a lot of fairy tale literature, and in a lot of the Arabian Nights in particular, are thought experiments, speculative fiction, in which models of possible societies, possible ways of being, possible beings even, possible creatures, possible metamorphoses, things that are going way, way beyond the purlieus of reason, but then actually are moving us, with hindsight reading the book, moving us towards something that has actually come about. I didn't talk, because I gave a talk last year about this at NYU, so I sort of felt I shouldn't talk about it again. But the development from the idea of the sacred word, the word that engenders the angel, or the gap between the words, or the gap between the letters that engender the angels, there is actually a very strange corollary to that, I think, a very unpredictable one, which is that the Enlightenment is the period when the first paper money is printed. And
Very interesting. Go on.
In the West.
well, there's an experiment in Ming China, but it's a very brief experiment because it very quickly ran into inflation. They didn't know how to. In fact, of course, it runs very quickly into inflation in our case too, but it became and they're also into forgery. So the Ming China
A forgery?
the Ming China experiment, they did indeed invent paper money, but it was not in circulation at all. We had forms of circulating currency in terms of letters of credit, IOUs, and various promissory notes, firmans. You know, there was a way in which the handwritten could guarantee the exchange of value. But it was the Enlightenment whereby the certificate written was printed and became the absolute staple organizing principle of capital. And that is where we are pretty much now, except we no longer have printed money, we now have even more virtual money. But the interesting thing about that is that the Arabian Nights stories are about virtual money. I mean, there are numerous stories in the Arabian Nights which are about Ponzi schemes, and which are about scams, and which are about literally jinn printing money. I mean, that's what the stories are about. They imagine a world in which money has become phantasmic. But by imagining it, this world, it isn't that they bring it into being, is that they intuit something that is actually dangerous about what might happen to the exchange of goods, which is exactly Marx's point. You know, when the value of the goods is different from the actual value of what's circulating around them. And we are all living that now. So this is what I mean about a watermark, that the enchantment, these stories are heavenly. Maruf the Cobbler is one of the most amusing stories you could possibly read, in which Maruf simply blags himself, you know, into a world of fantastic riches. Because every time he's lent some money by a friend, he throws it to beggars. And so And so people say, well, his caravan, when it comes in, must be so fantastic, because every time we lend him some money, he just tosses it to beggars saying, let them have it, I wait for my caravan to come. And by the time everyone is so deeply in the debts accumulating, they have to believe in his caravan. And of course they do. And it's, I mean, it's a marvelous parable. It's an Enron parable written in the 15th century. So that was just, but I was very, very struck that this idea of the endlessly duplicated power of the written, inscribed word could become, and the word talisman itself comes from Arabic, from Greek, and it means certificate. So then was applied to telesma, or tilsam. Telesma in Greek, tilsam.
Sir?
Oh, this is just a more prosaic question for both of you. Does the arrival of the Arabian Nights in the European languages, first French and then the others, does this act as the spur that produces modern short story? Or
Well, yes and no. There was the medieval fableau. There's a long Western tradition which goes back to Lucian, in fact, in the Hellenistic period, with the true history and other things.
Yeah, wonderful.
There's Apuleius and others.
Yes. The true history lies behind a lot of these things.
Undoubtedly, it abetted it to a considerable degree. When you get to someone like Maupassant or Edgar Allan Poe, who actually calls them tales of Araby and so on, arabesque, then clearly there's a very strong effect being felt. I think it augmented something that was already there. But of course, that's part of the point of Marina's life's work. Our distinctions between the East and the West are spurious. Hard to believe at this horrible time, except maybe all times. You know, as I get older, I begin to believe that things do not get better or worse, they just get older. Human beings do not get better. Old bloom does not get, it just gets older. The state of the United States, even though I fear the coming election, we're just older. The so-called Arab Spring is just a coming-of-age phenomenon. And it doesn't look like spring at the moment. It looks like winter indeed. There's something wrong with the way we think about these things. And I think that's the great virtue, not just of her Stranger Magic book, but of all of Marina's work. Though she would not agree with this, I, who am a mere secularist, I view her as a kind of magus.
Mongoose?
Magus, M-A-G-U-S. A magus, yes.
I thought a mongoose.
She is a mystagogue. She is a kind of Hermes figure, a mercurial lady, as it were. I think she carries in her something more vital, perhaps, than she herself even apprehends, a kind of spirit of breaking down the accepted categories between life and art, between the East and the West, between story and what is more than story, between fiction and that rather wavering thing we call the truth. I notice in the closing pages of the book that she's fascinated by Wittgenstein, who I've always found a very curious phenomenon. When I was a young man at Cornell, I spent a great deal of time with a couple, Stuart and Kitty Brown, whose closest friends were Norman and, what was her name again, dear? Malcolm? It will come back to me. When we went there for a year, finally, we lived in their house and in my study as I tried to finish a huge book on Yeats. There was a remarkable photograph of Wittgenstein. And I remember that in the summer of 1947, when I lived with the Browns, frequently Kitty Brown went to the supermarket. I didn't realize that I was talking to the great Wittgenstein. He was just someone who lived, Lee Malcolm. He was somebody who lived with Norman and Lee Malcolm. We had endless conversations all that summer. It wasn't until 10 years later that I realized that this was a remarkable thinker. I was then a very mystical young man deep in St. John of the Cross. He was very mystical indeed, and Tolstoy, and we talked about Tolstoy and St. John of the Cross. And we got along very well for a while as we sat there on park benches outside various supermarkets. And I was a rather preternatural 17 or 18-year-old. And we started to clash on the subject of Shakespeare. He once said to me that Shakespeare was too English. I said, that's rather like saying that Walt Whitman is too American. He said, no, he said, Harold, that's not what I mean at all. I mean that he deceived himself. He thought that he was rendering real men and women, and he wasn't. Life is not like that. And I said, well, I even remember this. I must have been, it was the summer, I think, that I turned July 11th, 1948, the summer I turned 18. I remember saying to him, and as I say, I had no idea whom I was talking to, just this rather gaunt, fascinating-looking fellow who lived with the Malcolms and who was clearly unwell. He died not long afterwards. Though he couldn't have been more than in his late 50s, perhaps. But at 18, who understands these things? I understood nothing at 18. But I remember one disagreement in which I finally said, well, it's no good saying that Shakespeare is to this or to that, because he is outside you and you are inside him, and he's governing you. And Wittgenstein said to me, well, Hume protested that, and I protest that also. I said, it doesn't do any good protesting that, because in the end, he provides the context, and you're just a figure inside the context. I don't know whether I was right or wrong. Many years later, I read his Cecil, his various sayings and aphorisms, many of which actually show great reservations about Shakespeare. And he finally wants to dismiss us, he says, just as a creator of language, which is very inadequate. Shakespeare matters because he creates human beings, like God. If there is God, he creates human beings. But something always troubled me in our conversations. I've never written about this, and I don't think I ever will write about this, because I never really understood what was going on at the time. And I'm getting so old now that I'm not sure I can trust my memories. But it had something to do with the whole question of what takes precedence, what comes first. Has Shakespeare got priority, or has some rational apprehension, be it Plato's insofar as Plato is rational, or David Hume, who did not like and who distrusted Shakespeare, as Wittgenstein did. Hegel did not. Hegel worshipped Shakespeare. He said that Shakespeare was the only writer who had created men and women who were free artists of themselves, which is a great phrase.
Yes.
I think it comes down to that in the end. Marina's book, My Life's Work Such as It Is, Marina's Life Work Such as It Is, it comes down to Shakespeare.
Well, I was called after a character in Shakespeare, so I'm called after Marina and Pericles.
That's right, yes. The lost child who is found
Yes,
again.
and who speaks her way out of trouble.
One question, and then I'm exhausted. Young man, yes.
I just wanted to add, neologism coinage is something Shakespeare.
Young man, come closer. Even though I have my artificial ears in, I'm tired, and I don't think I understand what you're saying. Come closer. And then we really must end.
Neologism coinage. If words are angels, then Shakespeare coined many words.
Well, Shakespeare has the largest vocabulary of any writer in the history of the world. 23,000 separate words, 1,800 of which he invented himself, 1,200 of which are still in common use.
They also say neologism coinage.
When you consider that Racine, a very great poetic dramatist, can do it all with, I believe, 1,300 words altogether. It's stunning, it's astonishing. But what is the point of your question, sir?
No, it wasn't a question, I was
It was a
just
comment,
wondering
yes.
your-
The comment that
see.
he created not only characters but also angels as words, word angels. Actually, the other person who creates word angels is Thomas Brown, who I love.
Ah, yes. Well, maybe we can end
Yes.
on Thomas Brown,
Yes.
both. For the iniquity of oblivion blindly scattereth her poppies and makes of our lives what she will. And the even darker statement, oblivion is not to be hired, Hired. Thank you, that's it.
Sorry. Rather wonderful manuscript of the Arabian Nights. So there's only 22 manuscripts, and not any one single one of them is complete. So the book is made of different editions of different. And this is one that happens to be in London, which I've seen. And as you see, what I loved about it is that it's been completely read to bits. And it's also annotated decorated by the and possibly by the owner. There are different hands in it. And you see here, this, I think, is the tally of the people in the room. I think here the storyteller is counting how many people he's talking to. You see, there's numbers. I mean, there's like saying, there's... otherwise I don't know what that would mean. And then this you'll probably be familiar with. This is the first edition of the French translation, the first time the book is printed in any language. This is the pirated edition from The Hague, because it was so popular instantly that it was pirated. And it's quite, the edition is very beautiful, actually, with lots and lots of engravings. I'm afraid the images are getting stretched, which is really unfortunate. When we had them upstairs, we corrected that, so you're seeing them much too wide. The aspect is wrong. You can't fix it, can you? Where's the technician? You can't fix the aspect. And so this was to show you that it continued to be popular throughout the 18th century, the age of the Enlightenment. And particularly the stories that had showed the working of this kind of speculative, experimental mind, which is what I was trying to say about Enchanting Reason. Because this horse is not an animal. This is an automaton. The story of the magic horse in the Arabian Nights is the story of a machine. That's very different from Pegasus or from Greek kind of encounters between marvels and it very, the 18th century was a period of, or a bit earlier. Yesterday in the Met, I saw quite a lot of automata from the 17th century. This is the period when automata are really what the scientific mind is working on. So these medieval stories already, this horse is described as having a peg on the mane and a peg on the tail to go up and down. And I concentrated just for this PowerPoint, I concentrated on this one case of imagining flight before flight. The idea of the enchantment of reason being the idea that you can project further into possibilities through using fantasy rather than through using a verifiable experiment in the 19th century form. So here are the jinn. I just very quickly go through the jinn. They are illustrated in Persian manuscripts. Here's Solomon being carried on his throne. And as you see, the jinn have hybrid animal forms. These are the good jinn, which is why they are carrying Solomon. But you also get evil jinn. Here wonderful Persian miniature. This is a jinni, this one, with animal heads. The others are the angels. And Solomon's power, very often expressed through a ring, which is a seal. Oh.
Sorry, we are escaping,
Don't let us interrupt.
Forgive me for interrupting.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.
Thank you very much.
Medication, child. Marina, we will meet again in this life.
To be the way the word is transmitted into object and then into reality, so that the power of the jinn that are ruled by Solomon is infused into the calligraphy, which is then carved into the gem, which is then transmitted by being sealed. And the story is, in a sense, the print of the seal. It's exactly the way where you pack the magic into the story, into the narrative, and it becomes an energetic object. So this is sort of analogy of the narrative. So in the first edition, the 18th century edition, that's the first Western image of Aladdin's genie. You see how different he looks. But he catches what is true in the book and in the Quran too, that the jinni are not defined in shape or scale. They're completely metamorphic. They can be very, very small or very, very huge. And so here, this is Aladdin's mother fainting with pleasure and delight and astonishment when the meal, or finally the jinni brings the meal, because they've been starving for a while. This is a much later one that I rather like, actually, from a young man from Singapore, was an illustrator who died young. And that's his version of the genie from Aladdin. And then I wanted to concentrate very quickly, I'm just going to rush through because we're going to be too late otherwise, on the fact that the defining quality of the jinn are that they are extremely volatile. And that's both metaphorical and literal. I mean, they are air, fire, and they're beings of shimmering fire, I think is what it says in the Quran. And so their element is air, which is why they carry Solomon on his throne, because they are Solomon's given mastery of the winds, and the winds are embodied in the jinn. So one of the things that happens, as I mentioned earlier, is that you can be transported by a jinni or a jinnia in the stories. So the narrator can move extremely swiftly through different parts of a plot. And here, Maruf, the cobbler, about to perform his Ponzi scheme, is being carried. And there's some artists are very marvelously inspired. And this is Badura, and she's enveloped in her veil, and he's holding her veil in his teeth as he carries her. She's dreaming, but she's carried to her lover. So this now I'm in the section. Many ways of flying are imagined in the nights. One of the most popular is the being carried by a giant bird. And the interesting intuition in this is that in the West, in the mythology of the West, the flyer imitates the bird. In the Arabian Nights, the bird is simply the vehicle that lifts. There isn't this is a recognizable Greek humanist vision, individualist humanist vision. You become the bird. Daedalus and Icarus, the wings are made for Icarus and for Daedalus. But in the Nights, you're just carried by a bird in many different ways. So that's, I just put that in. Then also, the jinn can get into any object, and as soon as they are infused into an object, that object becomes volatile. So there's a wonderful scene in the Aladdin of the Beautiful Moles, where they take off from Alexandria, or they take off from Baghdad to go back to Alexandria. And what I love about this illustration is that he's created the chaise longue as if it's a tiller. It looks as if they're using the rudder on the bed as they fly through the air on the charmed bed. And it becomes, in fact, Philippe Alain Michaud, who you might know him. Do you know him? He's a very interesting art historian and film historian at the Pompidou Center in Paris. He's just written a book about the analogies between the flying carpet and film. And one of the places that this idea of the flying medium, the flying vehicle, gets into contemporary culture, contemporary imagination, is through film. Because film shares that quality with jinn, that it is volatile. It has no weight. It's a medium that is made itself of light, and therefore it tends from its earliest developments. This is an early film in which you get spectacular flights in film, because there is no materiality to the beings projected by the camera. Sorry, I'll just quickly. And then here the magic carpet, which makes a very small appearance in one of the stories in the Nights, but then spreads from that into the whole of Western imagination. And the difference between here again, as with the giant birds lifting the heroes or heroines, the difference here is that this seems preposterous, but in fact it's an intuition of aerodynamics that's much better, much more accurate than the ornithopter model, which was the Western model, that you made a vehicle that was like a bird and that lifted you. Because this is the aerodynamics of the sail. Basically, the flying carpet is a sail, and it's a sail that's a projection of a natural navigating character, people. Yeah. No. This is the name of the story. The story is called Prince Ahmed and Fairy Berry Banu. Those are the three brothers. Mm. Yeah, there's the three princes, brothers, they're rushing to rescue Peri Banu. No, they're not rushing to rescue Peri Banu, they're rushing to rescue Princess Naroniha, who's ill. And they see through their spyglass, magic spyglass, that she's ill, and they cure her with the apple. He's got the cure apple. And they've managed to fly to her fast on the carpet in that story. So, then it isn't, yes? Yeah, meat.
For bullion.
Meat extract. Yeah. It's meant to make you able to do such things as fly on a carpet. That's right. Popeye and his spinach, yes. Flesh extract, yes. So this is actually a sad sort of film story because Douglas Fairbanks bought the rights to one of the first films that had a flying carpet in it, which is Fritz Lang's Destiny. And he bought the rights in order to suppress it until his film came out. He learned a lot of the special effects from Destiny. He went to Berlin and saw a lot of the Berlin experimental films, and then he used some of their tricks, and he saw this special effect. But this is the first famous one, 1924. And it was done to show you the difference between imagination and realization. This was done on a steel sheet, swung from a crane, extremely dangerous. So they had a huge tall crane, they swung them on it. And then, so very quickly you get this speculative fiction, which is some of it just pre-Enlightenment and then Enlightenment. And I think this illustration to Cyrano de Bergerac's idea of flying to the moon shows every influence of the idea of the jinn. Because these are bottles around his neck, around his waist, are filled with dew, which is evaporating in the rays of the sun, and hence lifting him. And this is Francis Godwin, a marvelous story called Voyage to the Moon or something. And I can't remember what it's called. This is another one. I'm just going to go a bit quickly now, but he's the first one with flight of this kind who actually shows the direct influence of the Nights. He quotes quite a lot of the stories in this book, which is called The Adventures of Peter Wilkins. And he describes how she flies like that. We're near here an ornithopter idea, but it is at least a flat sail rather than a bird shape. And that became a very popular theme for theatrical performances. And some of the first uses of wires to fly actors on stage was used to dramatize this particular book, which is now forgotten, The Adventures of Peter Wilkins. It was an example of utopian Enlightenment fiction that was hugely like Robinson Crusoe, but was hugely successful at the time. This is my favorite of all. This is Rétif de la Bretonne. Some of you will know him as a famous pornographer. And his name, Rétif, became the word for shoe fetishism in French, rétifisme, because there's so many, in his fiction, there's so many shoes. And I think also in his diaries, I think he was. But anyway, here he imagined, this is 2 years before the first balloon ascent. So it's possible that he knew people developing the idea of a balloon, but it's also in the book, in the story, which is called The Discovery of the Southern Land. The book is well known in Australia because it's a kind of Australasian fantasy. But as you see, he describes in great detail the flying suit of his hero. And what I like about this is that you can see how material culture actually shapes the form fantasy takes. Because here we basically have flying as dreamed up by a corset maker. I mean, this is all a kind of tremendous structure that you might wear under an 18th century crinoline. whereas in the culture where people wear loose clothes, and you imagine the flying carpet, but so there's this or umbrellas. This is sort of like well, he's got an umbrella and a kind of bathing cap too. But anyway, after that, one of the things that I realized while doing the book is that our basic canon of fairy tales doesn't really include flying. We have flying that is sorcery, witchcraft, and to some extent some fairies are airborne. But on the whole, the fairy tale tradition, if you think of Cinderella or Puss in Boots or Sleeping Beauty or Red Riding Hood, they are not volatile. They are grounded. They don't have, the enchantment doesn't take, the fairy godmother appears, but she's walking. And she changes, it's not, doesn't have this airborne, airy, enchanted quality. But after the 18th century, it becomes the absolute signature of fantasy storytelling and fantasy cinema. And this is Peter Pan. Peter Pan is, about the children flying to Neverland. And then there's one that I'm very fond of, The Phoenix and the Carpet, by E. Nesbit. And there the children do fly around on the carpet. Mary Poppins, you can see here the parentage. Mary Poppins, very learned, very, very well read, and very scholarly woman. Knew what she was doing. Oh, and we've had that. And then, of course, now, you can barely take a child to a film, or indeed even go to an adult film without seeing the experience of flight. And so that's it. I really liked Avatar, and I thought it showed a lot of connections to this idea of the utopian defense, the idea of the battle defending Pandora. Seemed to me to have quite a lot of connection to the epic quality of some of the stories.
And I thank you very much for coming and being